After my wife passed away, her 3 children inherited $20 million. And me, the man who stood by her for 45 years, I was given nothing but a single rusted key. They laughed in my face. They called me the free housekeeper. They threw me out into the freezing rain. But before I walked away from the life I built, I flipped the faded tag on that key. It read, "Hawaii Island, trust me one last time." And when I got there, I realized my wife did not leave her greedy children a fortune. She left them a ticking time bomb, and she gave me the detonator. If you are just starting to watch this story now, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen after nearly half a century of loyalty and love. Sometimes the people you raise, the ones you sacrifice everything for, are the exact same people waiting to stab you in the back the moment you no longer serve a purpose to them. If you have ever given your life to people who treated you like you meant absolutely nothing to them, hit that like button right now. Let me know in the comments where you are watching this from, because what I did next is something they never saw coming. The air in Mr. Gallagher's mahogany-paneled office in downtown Seattle was so thick you could choke on it. The rain was lashing aggressively against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a fitting backdrop for the coldness inside the room. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, my rough, calloused hands resting heavily on my knees. At 79 years old, after decades working as a commercial construction contractor, my hands told the story of a man who had built things from the dirt up. Across the heavy oak table from me sat Preston, Valerie, and Trent. They were my late wife Evelyn's children from her first marriage. The children I had raised, paid for, and loved as my own since they were barely out of diapers. Preston, now a 50-year-old hotshot investment director, sat with an arrogant slouch in his custom-tailored Italian suit. Valerie, 48 and entirely dependent on her mother's credit cards, was busy checking her reflection in her phone screen. Trent, 45 and drowning in gambling debts he thought I did not know about, was nervously tapping his foot. Mr. Gallagher cleared his throat. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, looking down at the thick stack of legal paperwork, carefully avoiding my eyes. He took a deep breath and read the final lines of Evelyn's will. The estate, including $20 million in cash, liquid stocks, and the Seattle property, is to be divided equally among Preston, Valerie, and Trent. Silence filled the room. It was not a respectful silence for a grieving widower. It was a greedy, electric silence. Valerie let out a dramatic breath she had been holding. Trent smirked, leaning back and crossing his arms behind his head like he had just won the lottery. Preston actually chuckled, a low, guttural sound of pure triumph. I just sat there. I did not blink. I waited for Gallagher to turn the page. I waited for him to read my name. I was her husband. We had restructured her company together 20 years ago. I had poured my entire life savings, every penny I made from my contracting business, into keeping her company afloat when the real estate market crashed. I had rebuilt our home. Surely there was a trust, a provision, something that acknowledged my existence. Gallagher closed the heavy folder. He slowly reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small, worn manila envelope and slid it across the smooth wooden table toward me. "That is for you, Rick," he said quietly. His voice lacked the booming authority he had used to announce the $20 million. He looked ashamed. I reached out and picked up the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. I tore the sealed edge open and tipped it into my palm. A single rusted brass key fell out, accompanied by a small paper tag attached by a frayed piece of string. That was it. 45 years of absolute loyalty. 45 years of fixing their broken bones, paying their college tuitions, bailing Trent out of his financial disasters, dealing with Valerie's endless shopping addictions, and tolerating Preston's insufferable ego. I got a rusted key. Preston stood up and casually buttoned his expensive jacket. He looked down at me, his eyes full of absolute contempt. "Do not look so shocked, Rick," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You were just Mom's free housekeeper for 45 years. Be grateful she left you a little souvenir to remember her by." Valerie chimed in, adjusting her silk designer scarf. Honestly, Rick, you should have seen this coming. This is family money. You were always just a blue-collar contractor she married out of convenience. You never really belonged in our circle, and now we do not have to pretend anymore. Trent laughed. Yeah, well, the free ride is over, old man. A hot flash of anger rose in my chest, a primal urge to reach across the table and show Preston exactly how much strength was left in these old contractor hands. But I pushed it down. I am a man who measures twice and cuts once. I do not waste my energy yelling at fools. I looked at the three of them. I looked at the tailored suits and the expensive jewelry I had secretly helped finance when Evelyn was too exhausted to deal with their demands. I closed my fist around the rusted key. The sharp edges bit deeply into my palm, the physical pain grounding my racing mind. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear or a broken voice. I just looked Preston dead in the eye and spoke softly. You have no idea what it takes to build a life, Preston. You only know how to spend what others have built for you. Preston sneered, his face turning red. Get out of the house by tonight. I am putting the Seattle estate on the market tomorrow morning, and I want all your garbage gone. Do not make me call security to escort you off the property right now. I stood up, adjusting the collar of my worn jacket. I turned my back on the $20 million and the three vultures picking at their mother's bones. I walked out of the mahogany office and stepped into the freezing Seattle rain. I did not know it yet, but that little rusted key burning a hole in my pocket was about to unlock a secret that would shatter their entire world. And the empire Preston thought he just inherited was nothing but a fragile house of cards, waiting for a strong gust of wind. The drive back to the house in the freezing Seattle downpour felt like a march to my own execution. Every mile that passed was a heavy reminder of the life I was being forced to leave behind. But I am not a man who breaks easily. I gripped the steering wheel of my old Ford truck, the only vehicle in my name, and watched the windshield wipers struggle against the heavy sheets of rain. When I pulled up to the driveway of the estate, the house I had shared with Evelyn for over 4 decades, my stomach tightened. I did not just live in this house. I resurrected it. When Evelyn's business was failing 20 years ago, we had to lay off the maintenance staff. I was the one who climbed onto the steep roof in the dead of winter to fix the shingles. I was the one who reinforced the foundation when the soil started shifting. Every piece of oak, every brass fixture, every inch of drywall had my sweat baked into it. And now the sprawling multi-million-dollar home was completely dark, except for the harsh, glaring headlights of a luxury SUV parked crookedly across my driveway. Valerie and Trent had beaten me there. I stepped out of the truck, the icy rain immediately soaking through my thin canvas jacket. Before my boots even hit the first step of the porch, the heavy oak front door swung violently open. Valerie stood there, her arms crossed, wearing a designer trench coat that probably cost more than my first truck. Behind her, Trent was dragging 2 large canvas suitcases across the polished hardwood foyer. My suitcases. The ones I used when I deployed to Vietnam, long before these spoiled children were even a thought in Evelyn's mind. Without a word of hesitation, Trent heaved the first suitcase out the door. His face twisted into an ugly, triumphant sneer as he did it. It hit the wet wooden planks of the porch with a heavy, sickening thud, sliding to a stop at my feet. The second suitcase followed immediately, bouncing off the railing and spilling a few of my flannel shirts onto the muddy grass below. Valerie stepped forward, sheltered by the massive awning I had installed, specifically because she used to complain about getting wet while fumbling for her house keys in high school. You need to leave, Rick, Valerie demanded, her voice flat and completely devoid of any human empathy. Preston wants the locks changed by midnight, and the security team is already on their way. We are not playing games with you. You have no legal right to step foot in this house ever again. The title is in our name now, and we want you gone before the neighbors start asking questions. I stood there in the freezing downpour. The cold water was running down my face, soaking into my collar, but my blood was boiling so hot, I barely felt the chill. I did not drop to my knees. I did not beg them for a few more days. I did not ask for a single penny of their $20 million. I just looked at the two of them standing in the warm glow of the foyer, looking at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto their pristine property. I stepped up onto the porch, my heavy boots making the wood groan under my weight. Trent took a nervous step back, bumping into the doorframe. He always was a coward when things got physical. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice cutting through the sound of the pouring rain. I built this porch with my own bare hands when you were still wetting the bed, Trent. I said, my tone low and dangerous. I leveled the joists so your mother would have a safe place to sit in the mornings. I looked over at Valerie, who was suddenly gripping the door handle very tightly, and I paid for the expensive private college degrees you both failed out of. I continued, stepping closer. When your mother wanted to cut you off for wasting her money on parties and designer clothes, I was the one who talked her down. I was the one who wrote the checks to cover your mistakes so you would not go to jail. Neither of them had a single word to say to that. The truth is a heavy thing, and they had spent their entire lives running from it. Valerie's jaw tightened. Her eyes darted away from mine, unable to handle the weight of her own guilt. You are nothing but a memory now, she hissed, her voice trembling slightly. Goodbye, Rick. She stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a sharp metallic click. Then the porch light clicked off, plunging me into complete darkness. The rain seemed to fall even harder, then punishing me for reasons I could not yet understand. I was entirely alone. Just a 79-year-old man standing in the freezing Seattle rain with 2 suitcases and absolutely nothing to my name. The cold began to seep into my bones. For a brief second, the exhaustion of 45 years of marriage washed over me. I reached into my soaked pocket and pulled out the small manila envelope Gallagher had given me. The paper was already disintegrating in the rain. I let the wet paper fall away, leaving the rusted brass key resting in my rough palm. I used my thumb to flip over the faded tag attached to it. The ink was old, but Evelyn's elegant handwriting was unmistakable, shielded from the rain by a thin layer of protective tape. I held it up to the faint, flickering streetlight, squinting through the heavy falling rain, and carefully read the final words my wife ever wrote to me. Hawaii Island, trust me one last time, Rick. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the damp cab of my Ford truck, waiting for the sun to rise over Seattle. I did not sleep. My mind was running through 45 years of memories, searching for the missing piece. Evelyn was a tough businesswoman. She could be ruthless in the boardroom, but she was never cruel to me. Not once. She did not leave me a rusted key as a sick joke. I knew her better than anyone. She built an empire from the ground up, and she always had a contingency plan. That key was a blueprint. I just had to read it. When the bank finally opened, I was the first person inside. I did not bother trying to access the joint accounts. I knew Preston would have already locked those down with his corporate lawyers. Instead, I walked up to the teller and pulled up my personal retirement account. It was a small fund I had quietly maintained from my early contracting days, holding just enough to cover a rainy day. I drained every penny. I walked out with enough cash to buy a one-way ticket to Maui. I drove straight to the airport, leaving my truck in the long-term parking lot with the keys sitting on the dashboard. I did not care what happened to it. I was not coming back to this city. The flight over the Pacific Ocean was a surreal experience. I sat in the cramped economy seat surrounded by families in bright floral shirts and excited honeymooners. They were traveling toward paradise, carrying bags full of sunscreen and expensive cameras. I was traveling toward a mystery, carrying a rusted key and the heavy weight of a broken family. I stared out the small oval window for hours, watching the deep blue expanse of the ocean below. I trusted my wife. I trusted the woman who had held my hand through the darkest periods of our lives. If she told me to go to Hawaii, I was going. When the plane touched down in Maui, the thick tropical air hit me the second I stepped out of the terminal. It was a stark contrast to the freezing Seattle rain that still chilled my bones. I found a quiet bench near baggage claim and pulled out the small paper tag attached to the key. It did not have a street address. It only had a set of geographical coordinates scribbled in Evelyn's neat handwriting. I walked over to a local taxi stand and showed the numbers to an older driver. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the paper, and shook his head. He told me those coordinates were completely off the grid. There were no paved roads leading to that side of the island. The only way to get there was by water. I took a cab down to a weathered marina on the southern coast, far away from the massive resort hotels and crowded tourist beaches. The docks smelled of salt spray, diesel fuel, and fresh fish. I walked up and down the wooden planks until I found a local fisherman securing a battered aluminum skiff. I showed him the coordinates and offered him $300 in cash to take me there. He looked at the money, then looked at my worn canvas jacket and tired eyes. He nodded slowly, untying the thick mooring lines without asking any unnecessary questions. The boat ride was rough. We hammered through the choppy coastal waves for over an hour, leaving civilization far behind us. The coastline shifted from populated sandy beaches to towering, jagged volcanic cliffs covered in dense, dark green jungle. The fisherman steered the small skiff expertly through the turbulent water, navigating around hidden coral reefs that could tear the bottom of a boat wide open. The isolation of the area was absolute. There were no power lines, no cell phone towers, no signs of human interference. Just the raw, untamed power of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the ancient rock. Eventually, the fisherman slowed the sputtering outboard motor. He pointed a calloused finger toward a break in the massive cliffs ahead. We drifted slowly into a hidden cove, and the violent waves instantly smoothed out into calm glass like water. As we moved deeper into the bay, my breath caught in my throat. It was the most beautiful, untouched piece of land I had ever seen. Lush green valleys rolled down into a pristine crescent-shaped beach. The water was a brilliant glowing turquoise, so clear I could see sea turtles gliding over the vibrant reef 30 feet below. But I was not looking for a vacation spot. I was looking for Evelyn's final gift. I scanned the dense tree line, expecting to see a hidden luxury villa or a secure concrete bunker. Instead, my eyes locked onto a structure sitting right at the water's edge. It was a rotting wooden shack. The roof was partially caved in, the wooden siding was bleached white by the harsh tropical sun, and the front porch was sagging heavily into the sand. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The fisherman killed the engine, letting the skiff slide gently onto the soft white sand. He looked at me with a confused expression, clearly wondering why an old man from the mainland had paid him to visit a pile of decaying lumber. I stepped out of the boat, the warm water soaking my heavy boots. I thanked the fisherman and told him I would not be needing a ride back. He tipped his hat and pushed off, the sound of his engine slowly fading away until I was left in absolute, total silence. I walked slowly up the beach, my eyes tracing the lines of the ruined structure. At first glance, it was completely worthless. But I am a contractor. I do not just look at buildings. I always look very closely at the land they sit upon. The foundation of the shack was built on solid bedrock, not loose sand. The positioning was deliberate, commanding the entire narrow entrance to the bay. Whoever owned this tiny, dilapidated square of property essentially controlled access to the miles of untouched paradise stretching out behind it. I walked up the creaking wooden steps, testing each one with my weight before shifting my balance. The wood was severely weathered, but the structural framing underneath was surprisingly solid. Evelyn always appreciated good bones in a property. I reached out and pushed the heavy, swollen front door. It scraped loudly against the warped floorboards, revealing a dark, dusty interior that smelled strongly of salt and dry rot. Just as I stepped over the threshold, a sharp electronic ringing shattered the quiet isolation of the bay. I paused. It was the cheap prepaid burner phone I had purchased at a gas station near the Seattle airport right before my flight. Only one person had that number. The estate lawyer Gallagher. I reached into my canvas jacket pocket, pulled out the small plastic phone, and looked at the glowing digital screen. It was an unknown mainland number. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear, not saying a single word. "Rick, is that you?" the voice on the other end asked. It was Preston. His tone was entirely different from the venomous sneer he had used in the mahogany-paneled office just 36 hours ago. Now his voice was dripping with a heavy artificial warmth. It was the exact same smooth, practiced tone he used when he was trying to close a lucrative investment deal with a hesitant client. I stood perfectly still in the dusty shadows of the shack, listening to the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing behind me, and let him talk. "Dude, listen." Preston continued, using a familial word he had never once directed at me in 50 years of knowing him. "We feel terrible about how things went down yesterday. Emotions were running incredibly high, and we all said some very harsh things that we deeply regret today. Valerie has been crying all morning. We know Mom left you that worthless scrap of land out in the middle of nowhere. It is an absolute insult to everything you did for her over the decades, and we want to make it right." I remained completely silent. The heavy silence forced Preston to fill the uncomfortable dead air. Con men always talk way too much when they start getting nervous. "Look," he said, his voice tightening just a fraction of an inch. "We genuinely want to do the right thing here for the family. We had our corporate real estate guys look into that remote parcel this morning. It is unbuildable, zoned out for any commercial development, and basically a liability with the upcoming property taxes. But you are family, Rick. We want to buy it from you. We are willing to wire $100,000 directly into your bank account by the end of the business day. You can take that money, buy a nice little comfortable condo down in Florida, and retire peacefully. You will never have to worry about a single financial thing ever again. Just sign the property deed over to us, and my legal team will handle all the messy paperwork and transfer fees." My intuition immediately spiked. A cold, sharp clarity washed over my entire mind. I am an older man, but my mind is as sharp as a newly honed steel chisel. Why would three incredibly greedy siblings, who had just inherited a massive $20 million estate and joyfully thrown me out into the freezing midnight rain, suddenly feel an overwhelming wave of generosity? Why would a hotshot corporate investment director like Preston be desperate to spend $100,000 on a rotting wooden shack that he just claimed was unbuildable and a tax liability? The math did not add up. The plausible lie was rapidly crumbling under the heavy weight of its own convenience. They did not want to help me retire comfortably in Florida. They needed this land. They needed it desperately, and they needed it fast before I had the chance to figure out what I actually held in my old calloused hands. Evelyn was a brilliant master chess player, and she had just handed me the most powerful piece on the entire board. The $20 million they inherited back in Seattle was nothing but a glittering distraction. This rotting wooden shack sitting quietly on the isolated edge of the vast Pacific Ocean was the actual grand prize. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the heavy, salty air of the Hawaiian coast. I did not yell at him. I did not curse him out. I did not demand any explanations or answers to my silent questions. I simply pulled the cheap plastic phone away from my ear, looked down at the glowing digital screen, and pressed the red button to end the call. I turned the device completely off, ensuring it would not ring again, and slipped it deep back into my jacket pocket. The profound silence of the secluded bay returned immediately, sounding much louder and infinitely more powerful than before. Let them sweat in their tailored suits. Let them wonder what the clueless old housekeeper was doing thousands of miles away. I turned my attention away from the mainland drama and stepped further into the dark shadows of the wooden shack. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim lighting, carefully scanning the accumulated debris scattered across the warped floorboards. I knew Evelyn. She would never send me to a place like this without leaving clear and exact instructions on what to do next. The key in my pocket was the first step, but there had to be something else hidden inside these decaying walls. I slowly walked toward the back of the single room, ready to uncover the truth. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the gaps in the rotting roof. I took my time, letting my eyes adjust completely to the dim interior. As a contractor, I have spent decades walking through abandoned buildings. You learn to look past the surface decay and focus on the structural skeleton. I ran my heavy boots over the warped wooden floorboards, feeling for any inconsistencies in the joists below. I walked from the front entrance toward the back wall, stepping carefully over scattered pieces of driftwood. The shack was no larger than a standard master bedroom, but something about the layout felt deliberately uneven. Near the back corner, right where the shadows were the thickest, my boot hit a section of the floor that did not creak. The wood sounded dull and solid, completely different from the hollow echo of the surrounding planks. I knelt down, ignoring the ache in my knees, and brushed away a thick layer of sand and dried leaves. Beneath the debris, the floorboards were cut with precision. There were no nails holding this specific square of wood to the joists. It was a perfectly concealed access panel. I wedged my calloused fingers into the narrow seam and pulled upward. The wooden panel lifted away with a soft groan, revealing a dark square cavity underneath. Nestled in the concrete foundation, protected from the salt air and high tides, was a heavy steel floor safe. The metal was dull, but it was completely free of rust. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small brass key Evelyn had left me. My heart beat a little faster in my chest. I brushed the remaining sand off the faceplate of the safe and inserted the rusted key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. I turned my wrist and a heavy internal tumbler clicked loudly into place. The sound echoed in the quiet shack like a gunshot. I grabbed the cold steel handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. Inside the dark cavity lay a thick, weather-sealed briefcase. It looked incredibly heavy and expensive, completely out of place in this rotting wooden structure. I reached down, grabbed the heavy leather handle, and hauled it up onto the solid floorboards. The latches popped open with a crisp snap. The briefcase was packed to the brim with neatly organized manila folders, thick stacks of legal documents, and large architectural blueprints. I pulled out the first folder, which was labeled with Evelyn's pristine handwriting. It simply said, "The True Legacy of Our Family." I sat down on the dusty floor, crossing my legs like I used to do on job sites 50 years ago, and began to read. The first documents were geological surveys commissioned by Evelyn over a decade ago. They were incredibly detailed, mapping out the subterranean structure of the coastal region. I traced my finger along the contour lines of the map. This dilapidated plot of land did not just sit on a rock. It sat directly on top of the only active freshwater aquifer in the geographic area. Millions of gallons of pure, unfiltered water flowed directly beneath this rotting shack. I unrolled a massive surveyor map and studied the property lines. Because of the steep volcanic cliffs surrounding the bay, this specific quarter-acre of land held exclusive coastal access rights for miles in either direction. I pulled out a second folder. This one contained confidential correspondence between Evelyn's corporate lawyers and a massive international resort conglomerate. The letters detailed an aggressive multi-billion-dollar development plan to turn the untouched bay behind the shack into a sprawling luxury eco-resort. But the developers had a massive problem. They could not build a single hotel room, pump a single drop of water, or lay down a single access road without owning this exact piece of land. Evelyn had quietly purchased the plot decades ago, locking down the choke point. She held the monopoly over the water and access. My eyes scanned the final document in the folder. It was an official commercial appraisal of the land, updated just 3 months before Evelyn passed away. The number printed at the bottom of the page made the breath catch in my throat. $50 million. I sat there in the silence staring at the typed zeros. $50 million. This was not a worthless scrap of land. This was the crown jewel of Evelyn's empire. The $20 million she left to Preston, Valerie, and Trent back in Seattle was pocket change compared to the immense power held in this single briefcase. Suddenly, the frantic phone call from Preston made perfect sense. He was the investment director. He had access to her recent financial inquiries. He knew exactly what this land was worth, and he knew the resort conglomerate was desperate to acquire it. He had tried to buy it from me for $100,000, hoping I was just a clueless, grieving old man who would take the first offer thrown my way. He thought he could steal millions from me with a single phone call. He thought I was stupid. A low, dry chuckle escaped my lips, echoing off the wooden walls. "Evelyn, you absolute genius," I whispered to the empty room. She knew her children were greedy, shallow, and entirely ruthless. She knew they would throw me out the moment her heart stopped beating, so she set a trap. She gave them the flashy wealth to keep them distracted and arrogant, but she handed me the ultimate leverage. She trusted me because I was the only person in her life who knew how to build a strong foundation, and I was the only one who knew exactly how to tear a corrupt one down. I placed the documents back into the briefcase and locked it. The game had completely and entirely changed. I was no longer the helpless victim in the rain. I carefully lowered the heavy steel door of the floor safe and pushed the wooden floorboards back into place, sweeping a thin layer of sand over the seams to hide the cracks. My mind was racing with possibilities, but my body was suddenly heavy with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried me across the Pacific Ocean was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing hunger and a thirst that the humid tropical air only made worse. I stepped out of the dark shack and back into the blinding Hawaiian sunlight. The fishermen had long since departed, leaving me stranded on the isolated beach. I had no boat, no vehicle, and only a few crumpled $20 bills left in my wallet after paying for the skiff. I began the grueling trek up the steep trail leading away from the cove, relying on my decades of physical labor to push my legs up the rock. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach a paved coastal highway. I hitched a ride with a local farmer who dropped me off in front of a small grocery store on the outskirts of the town. My plan was simple. I needed to buy some basic provisions, a bottle of water, and find a cheap motel room where I could rest and formulate a strategy to protect Evelyn's trust. I walked down the narrow aisles of the store, picking up a loaf of bread, some sliced ham, and a gallon of water. I carried my meager supplies to the front counter and pulled out my debit card. It was tied to my personal checking account, a small fund I used for daily expenses back in Seattle that held a few $1,000s. I slid the plastic card into the machine and waited for the familiar beep. Instead, the small screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. I frowned, assuming it was a simple reading error, and wiped the magnetic strip on my jacket before trying again. Declined. The cashier, a young woman with a sympathetic smile, suggested I try the ATM in the corner of the store. I walked over, inserted my card, and punched in my personal identification number. The screen loaded for a long moment before displaying a stark, terrifying message. Account frozen. Please contact your financial institution. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I stepped outside into the oppressive afternoon heat, pulled out my cheap burner phone, and dialed the customer service number on the back of my card. After navigating a maze of automated menus, I finally reached a human representative. I provided my social security number and verified my identity, asking why my personal checking account was suddenly inaccessible. The young man on the line sounded incredibly nervous. He placed me on a brief hold, and when he returned, his voice was tight. "Mr. Caldwell," he said slowly, "your accounts have been entirely locked by our fraud prevention department. A flag was placed on your profile early this morning, citing suspicious activity and unauthorized withdrawals. I demanded to know who authorized the freeze." The representative hesitated before explaining that the flag originated from the corporate banking division initiated by an executive wealth management director. Preston. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Preston was a high-level investment director with massive leverage over regional banks. When I refused his insulting $100,000 offer over the phone, he did not just get angry. He retaliated with the full crushing weight of his corporate power. He used his inside connections to falsely flag my accounts, locking me out of my own money. He knew I was thousands of miles from home. He knew I had drained my retirement to buy the plane ticket. And now he had deliberately cut off my last remaining lifeline, leaving a 79-year-old man completely penniless and stranded on an island. I ended the call and stared at the cracked pavement beneath my boots. The sheer cruelty of his actions was breathtaking. He was not just trying to steal the $50 million property. He was actively trying to break me. He wanted me starving, desperate, and begging for his help. I walked back into the store, put the bread and ham back on the shelves, and used my last physical dollar bills to buy the gallon of water. I sat on a wooden bench outside the humid air suffocating me, and tried to process the absolute malice of the children I had raised. Just as I unscrewed the cap of the water bottle, my burner phone vibrated in my pocket. It was not a phone call this time. It was a new email notification. I opened the message. It was from Gallagher, the estate lawyer back in Seattle. The subject line was urgent. I read the short clinical paragraphs, and my blood ran ice cold. Preston was not just freezing my bank accounts. He was initiating a brutal legal strike. According to the email, Preston, Valerie, and Trent had formally filed an emergency motion in the state court. They were petitioning a judge to declare me legally incompetent to manage my own affairs, citing advanced undiagnosed dementia. They claimed I had wandered off to Hawaii in a state of severe mental confusion and was a danger to myself. If the judge approved the medical conservatorship, Preston would gain total legal control over my identity, my signature, and any property I owned. They would lock me away in a quiet facility and steal Evelyn's final gift without me being able to fight back. I sat alone on the wooden bench in the fading island sunlight, feeling the heavy weight of the trap closing around me. I was broke, stranded on the island, and rapidly running out of time. I read the email 3 times, the harsh sunlight glaring off the screen of my cheap phone. Medical conservatorship. Dementia. Preston was trying to erase my legal existence. He wanted to strip away my rights, lock me in a sterile room, and take the $50 million property right out from under me. Panic is a luxury I have never been able to afford. When a roof starts to cave in, you do not sit down and cry. You find a support beam. I forced myself to stand up from the wooden bench, my knees aching in protest. I slung my worn canvas jacket over my shoulder and began walking down the dusty shoulder of the coastal highway. My mind raced back to the documents inside the floor safe. Among the geological surveys and the corporate letters, there was a single manila folder containing legal correspondence. The letters were signed by a local attorney here in Maui. His name was Kimo. Evelyn had trusted him to handle the quiet acquisition of the Choke Point property decades ago, bypassing the massive mainland law firms that Preston now controlled. If there was anyone on this island who understood the true gravity of the situation, it was him. I walked for nearly an hour under the unforgiving tropical sun before an old rusted pickup truck rattled to a halt beside me. The driver was a heavily tattooed local fisherman with a weathered face and a bed of ice coolers in the back. I climbed into the passenger seat, my boots resting on a floorboard covered in sand and stray fishing hooks. I gave him the address I had memorized from the documents. It was in a small working-class town on the other side of the island, far away from the glittering tourist resorts. The drive was long and quiet. I stared out the cracked window, watching the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean roll by, holding tightly to the gallon of water I had bought with my last few dollars. When the truck finally sputtered to a stop, I thanked the fisherman and stepped out onto a cracked sidewalk. The address led me to a small, unassuming storefront tucked between a closed-down surf shop and a bustling local bakery. There were no glass high-rises, no mahogany-paneled waiting rooms, and no arrogant receptionists in designer suits. The wooden sign above the door simply read, "Chemo and Associates Land Law." I pushed open the screen door. The office smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and sea salt. A large ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, doing very little to cut the stifling humidity. Behind a cluttered desk sat Chemo. He was a massive Hawaiian man, with silver hair tied back in a neat tail, wearing a faded floral shirt, and reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He looked up from a thick stack of property deeds as I walked in. He did not look impressed. I stood before his desk, acutely aware of how I must have looked. A 79-year-old mainlander sweating through a cheap flannel shirt, exhausted, broke, and carrying nothing but a plastic water bottle. "Can I help you?" friend Chemo asked, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. His tone was polite but firm, the kind of voice used to dismiss lost tourists who wandered off the beaten path. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my breathing. "My name is Richard Caldwell." I began, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need legal representation. I own a piece of property on the western coast, and my stepchildren are currently filing emergency motions in Seattle to declare me mentally incompetent to seize the deed." Chemo leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He looked me up and down, his eyes narrowing with a heavy dose of skepticism. "With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell," he said slowly, "I do not handle mainland family squabbles. If your kids are trying to put you in a home, you need a medical advocate, not a land attorney. Furthermore, I do not take walk-in clients, especially those who look like they just hiked out of the jungle. I suggest you call the local authorities if you need assistance getting back to your hotel." He reached for a pen, clearly signaling that our brief conversation was over. But I did not move. I planted my boots firmly on his scuffed linoleum floor. "I am not staying at a hotel," I said, my voice hardening into the sharp, commanding tone I used on chaotic construction sites. "I do not have a hotel room. My bank accounts have been entirely frozen by an executive director at a mainland financial institution. I am completely broke, and I am running out of time before a judge strips away my basic human rights." Chemo sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, I feel for you, I really do," he replied, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "But people come to this island every single day trying to escape their problems. I am a busy man. I protect local land from corporate developers. I do not have the time or the resources to fight a massive mainland legal team over a family dispute. Please, the door is right behind you." I knew words would not convince him. He dealt with desperate people all the time. I reached into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket. Before leaving the rotting shack, I had taken one specific piece of paper from the heavy steel floor safe. I pulled the folded document out and gently placed it flat on his cluttered desk. "I am not here to ask for your charity, Chemo," I said quietly. "I am here because my wife told me to trust you." Chemo glanced down at the paper. It was the original bill of sale. At the bottom, signed in blue ink, was her name, Evelyn. Chemo stared at the blue ink on the weathered paper. The heavy skepticism that had hardened his face just a moment ago vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. He slowly reached into the breast pocket of his floral shirt, pulled out a microfiber cloth, and methodically cleaned the lenses of his reading glasses. He slipped them back onto his face and leaned forward, holding the document up to the light of the spinning ceiling fan. The room was completely silent, save for the rhythmic humming of the old motor above us. For a long minute, he did not say a single word. He just studied the signature, tracing the familiar loops and sharp angles of Evelyn's handwriting with his eyes. Then he let out a long, heavy breath and set the paper gently back down on his cluttered desk. He looked up at me, and the dismissal in his eyes was entirely gone. It was replaced by a look of profound respect. Pull up a chair, Rick Chemo said softly, gesturing to a worn leather seat across from him. If Evelyn sent you all the way out here to find me, then we have a lot of work to do. I sank into the chair, my muscles finally getting a reprieve. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a few more folded documents I had brought from the hidden floor safe, sliding them across the desk. I told him about the $20 million handed to Preston, the rusted key, the eviction in the freezing rain, and the financial blockade launched to starve me out. Chemo listened silently, not interrupting me once. When I finished, he picked up the new documents I had provided. They were the geological surveys and the corporate correspondence Evelyn had hidden away. Chemo began to read through the dense legal jargon. At first his face was unreadable, a stone mask of professional concentration. But as he turned the second page, the corner of his mouth twitched. By the third page, a low rumble started deep in his chest. Suddenly he leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and let out a booming, genuine laugh. It was a rich, echoing sound that completely filled the small office. I sat there confused and a little defensive. I did not see what was so funny about my life being systematically destroyed by my stepchildren. Chemo caught the look on my face and quickly held up a hand, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. I am not laughing at you, Chemo said, his voice thick with amusement. I am laughing at the absolute terrifying brilliance of your late wife. Evelyn was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. But this is a masterpiece. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrests of the chair. Explain it to me, I said. Chemo tapped a thick finger against the documents. You think your stepchildren just inherited a $20 million empire? He began, his tone shifting into sharp, analytical focus. You think they are sitting in that Seattle mansion, drinking champagne and enjoying the fruits of your hard labor. But they are not. They are sitting on a powder keg, and the fuse has already been lit. He opened a side drawer of his desk, pulled out a thick, sealed folder, and dropped it right in front of me. Evelyn contacted me 6 months before she passed away. She knew exactly what Preston, Valerie, and Trent were doing. She knew they had been quietly embezzling funds from her corporate accounts for the past 5 years. Preston was using shell companies to funnel money into his high-risk investments. Trent was draining the liquid assets to cover his massive underground gambling debts. And Valerie was maxing out lines of credit tied directly to the company equity. I stared at the folder in disbelief. Evelyn knew, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did she not fire them? Why did she not call the police? Chemo smiled a grim, knowing smile. Because she knew that if she confronted them directly, they would just tie her up in endless corporate litigation, dragging her name through the mud while she was dying. So she chose a much more permanent solution. She let them think they were getting away with it. But while they were stealing, Evelyn was secretly restructuring the entire estate. Chemo leaned in close, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. That $20 million inheritance is a complete illusion, Rick. The Seattle estate and the corporate portfolios are heavily leveraged. There are massive hidden debts attached to every single asset she left them. But that is not the best part. He tapped the folder again. Evelyn quietly gathered every single shred of evidence proving their embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe tax evasion. And then she anonymously forwarded the entire portfolio to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. My heart pounded against my ribs. The federal government, I whispered. Chemo nodded slowly, letting the gravity of those words sink in. The federal government has been conducting a covert criminal investigation into Preston, Valerie, and Trent for the last 4 months. They are just waiting for the estate to formally clear probate, which happened yesterday when Mr. Gallagher read that will. By accepting the inheritance, your stepchildren legally accepted all the attached liabilities and the fraudulent corporate structures. Evelyn did not leave them a fortune, Rick. She left them a ticking time bomb, and they eagerly strapped it right to their own chests. They threw you out of the house because they thought you were a liability. In reality, she left you out of the will to completely protect you from the federal fallout. She gave them the poisoned chalice, and she gave you the one asset that is clean, unencumbered, and worth more than all their stolen money combined. This $50 million choke point property in Hawaii. I sat back in the worn leather chair, the profound gravity of Kimo's words settling over my shoulders like a heavy, suffocating wool blanket. The massive $20 million inheritance was nothing but an elaborate, glittering mirage. Evelyn had essentially handed her greedy children a lit stick of dynamite and calmly told them it was a solid gold candle. But the $50 million property, the very piece of overgrown land I had just walked across hours ago, was completely real. It was free, it was clear, and according to the documents resting on the desk, it belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the weathered bill of sale tracing my late wife's signature with my tired eyes. The sheer magnitude of her protective foresight brought a sudden fierce tightness to my chest. She had deliberately shielded me from the brutal federal investigation and simultaneously handed me the ultimate weapon to defend my own life. Kimo did not give me too much time to dwell on the deep emotional weight of this incredible revelation. He spun his heavy wooden chair around with surprising agility and cracked open a thick silver laptop resting on a cluttered side table. His thick fingers flew across the keyboard with the rapid, practiced speed of a man who spent his entire life hunting down buried secrets. If your stepson is desperate enough to try and declare you medically incompetent from across the ocean, Kimo muttered, his dark eyes glued to the glowing screen, then he is operating on a very tight and very dangerous timeline. People simply do not launch emergency medical conservatorships on a Sunday evening unless they have an immediate massive financial gun pointed directly at their own heads. Let us see exactly what Preston is hiding behind that arrogant, custom-tailored Italian suit of his. Kimo navigated through a complex series of encrypted local property databases, commercial registries, and confidential land transfer portals. The heavy silence in the small office was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard and the lazy, rattling hum of the overhead ceiling fan. As a veteran land attorney in Hawaii, Kimo possessed deep established connections and backdoor access to preliminary commercial filings that had not yet hit the public mainland records. I watched the bright reflection of the computer screen flicker softly across his thick reading glasses. The genuine amusement he had displayed just moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by a rigid, dangerous, and almost predatory focus. After several long, agonizing minutes of searching, he abruptly stopped typing. He let out a low, sharp whistle and slowly shook his head in absolute disbelief. "Rick, you are not going to believe the sheer catastrophic scale of the hole this boy has dug for himself," Kimo said, turning the laptop screen toward me so I could read it. I leaned forward in the leather chair, squinting at the dense legal text and the bright corporate logos illuminating the screen. It was a preliminary commercial sales contract. At the very top of the first page was the unmistakable bold logo of the massive international resort conglomerate that Evelyn had mentioned in her hidden files. At the very bottom of the final page, scrawled in stark black digital ink, was the electronic signature of Preston Caldwell. I stared at the glowing screen in absolute bewildered confusion, my jaw tight. How could he possibly sign a legally binding contract for a piece of coastal land? "He does not even own," I asked, my voice rising with anger. Kimo pointed a thick finger at a specific indemnity clause buried deep in the dense legal jargon of the contract. "Because he lied through his teeth," Kimo stated bluntly, crossing his massive arms. Preston confidently presented himself to the resort conglomerate as the sole legal executor and the primary uncontested beneficiary of Evelyn's entire estate. He used the $20 million mainland inheritance as a massive financial smokescreen to prove his corporate legitimacy. He boldly claimed that this Hawaiian choke point property was simply a forgotten, overlooked asset bundled into the larger portfolio he now fully controlled. The resort developers have been desperately trying to get their hands on this specific bay for over a decade. They were so incredibly eager to finally secure the freshwater aquifer and the exclusive coastal access rights that they completely rushed their standard due diligence. They wanted to lock the lucrative deal down before any rival international developers could swoop in and steal it. And to do that, they foolishly agreed to Preston's demand for an immediate, non-refundable cash deposit. Chemo highlighted a specific line of text showing a completed wire transfer. He pocketed $10 million yesterday. $10 million. Hearing that massive number, I felt a cold, prickling sweat break out on the back of my neck. But why the immediate rush, I asked, leaning back. If he knew he had to eventually pry the legal deed from my hands. Why sign the fraudulent contract and take the corporate money before the land was securely his? Because Preston is drowning, Chemo replied, his voice dark and incredibly serious. You thought Trent was the only one in that family with severe gambling problems. Trent plays underground poker. Preston plays the high-stakes international investment markets, and he treats them exactly like his own personal, unregulated casino. I just pulled his offshore financial background file. Preston has accumulated massive, catastrophic gambling debts over the last 12 months. He illegally leveraged his own corporate shell companies to the absolute limit, and his ruthless creditors were finally calling in the massive loans. He needed immediate, untraceable cash to avoid a very violent collection. He took the $10 million deposit from the resort developers to temporarily save his own skin, arrogantly, assuming he could easily force you to sign over the property deed immediately afterward. He thought you were just a weak, clueless old housekeeper who would be entirely powerless to ever stop his vicious plan. I looked at the glowing screen of the laptop, absorbing the sheer magnitude of Preston's fatal miscalculation. He had built his entire corporate survival on the absolute certainty that I would simply roll over and surrender. He assumed my age made me fragile, and that my grief made me blind. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. I spent my entire life as a commercial contractor. I know exactly how to read a blueprint, and I know exactly how to demolish a structure by simply removing a single load-bearing pillar. Chemo closed the silver laptop with a sharp, decisive click. So, the seasoned land attorney said, leaning forward and resting his massive elbows on the cluttered desk. We have a few options here, Rick. We can contact the mainland authorities right now, present this fraudulent contract to the federal investigators, and let the Internal Revenue Service arrest your stepson before the sun goes down. It would be clean, it would be fast, and it would immediately stop the emergency medical conservatorship he filed against you. I sat quietly in the worn leather chair, listening to the rhythmic humming of the overhead ceiling fan. I thought about the freezing rain in Seattle. I thought about Valerie throwing my canvas suitcases onto the wet porch and Trent laughing at my decades of sacrifice. I thought about Preston calling me a free housekeeper, staring at me with absolute contempt while he secretly plotted to lock me away in a medical facility just to cover his own gambling debts. A cold, heavy resolve settled deep into my chest. No, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any hesitation. If we call the federal investigators right now, he will just hire an army of expensive defense attorneys. He will claim it was a simple administrative misunderstanding, a paperwork error made in the emotional aftermath of his mother passing away. He will find a way to wriggle out of it, or at least drag the legal battle out for years while I rot in a courtroom. I do not want him to just get caught. I want him to completely shatter against the wall he built himself. Chemo smiled, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his weathered face. I was hoping you would say that, he murmured. What is the play, contractor? We secure the foundation, I replied. I need you to lock this property down so tightly that not even a team of Supreme Court justices could pry it out of my hands. Chemo immediately pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from his bottom desk drawer. We spent the next 4 hours drafting the paperwork for an ironclad independent trust. We transferred the deed of the $50 million Choke Point property directly from Evelyn's initial holding company into the newly formed trust, naming me as the sole irrevocable trustee. We embedded multiple layers of legal poison pills within the trust charter. If anyone, including a mainland judge, attempted to force a sale or transfer ownership through a medical conservatorship, the property would automatically be donated in its entirety to the Hawaiian State Conservation Authority. It was an unbreakable legal fortress. By the time we stamped the final signature page, Preston's fraudulent contract with the resort developers became absolutely worthless paper. He had sold them a phantom property. Kimo kindly advanced me a few $100s in cash from his own pocket to get me through the next couple of days. I thanked him, shook his massive hand, and walked out of the quiet law office with a renewed sense of vicious purpose. But the legal trap was only half of the equation. Preston and his siblings were still coming for me. They would not just accept defeat from a distance. They would fly across the ocean to intimidate me in person, relying on their usual tactics of aggressive bullying and physical threats. I needed undeniable concrete proof of their extortion, recorded right here in the jurisdiction of Hawaii. I walked down the street to a local hardware and electronics supply store. I used Kimo's loaned cash to purchase 4 high-definition battery-powered outdoor security cameras, a set of digital audio recorders, and a few basic hand tools. I caught a ride back to the isolated western coast, with the same fishermen from earlier, arriving at the hidden bay just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and burnt orange. I stepped back into the rotting wooden shack, but this time I did not see a decaying structure. I saw a soundstage. I spent the entire evening working by the light of a small camping lantern. My old hands moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. I mounted the first hidden camera high up in the rafters, angling the wide lens to cover the entire front doorway and the center of the warped floorboards. I tucked a second camera beneath the rotting eaves of the front porch, perfectly positioned to capture the faces of anyone approaching from the sandy beach. I strategically placed the digital audio recorders under the heavy wooden table and behind a stack of weathered driftwood in the corner. I tested every single device, ensuring the red recording lights were covered with black electrical tape, and the microphones were picking up even the softest whispers. By midnight, the dilapidated shack was fully wired. I sat down on the dusty floorboards, leaning my tired back against the solid wooden wall, and listened to the ocean waves crashing gently against the shore outside. I was no longer a stranded, broke man running from a powerful mainland family. I was a predator sitting patiently in the dark, waiting for the arrogant wolves to wander blindly into my territory. I didn't call the cops. I set the trap. Tell me in the comments, would you have warned them or let them walk right into their own destruction? Because I was ready to play dirty. The morning sun rose over the isolated bay, casting peaceful shadows across the sand. I sat at the weathered table in the center of the shack, nursing a cup of black coffee I made using a small camp stove. My prepaid phone sat silently next to my mug. I knew they were coming for me sooner rather than later. The sudden silence from Preston after his hostile maneuver with my bank accounts was the loudest warning sign. Bullies do not just retreat when their first punch fails. They regroup, escalate, and try to overwhelm you with sheer force. I had spent my career managing volatile construction sites, dealing with corrupt inspectors and aggressive suppliers. I knew how to read the tension before a structure collapsed. The air in the shack was thick with that exact tension. I checked the hidden cameras one last time from the monitor Kimo provided, ensuring feeds were recording directly to the secure cloud server. The red lights were completely concealed. Everything was perfectly in place. Around 10 in the morning, the profound silence of the cove was finally broken. It started as a distant hum echoing off the jagged volcanic cliffs, quickly growing into the deep roar of a high-powered marine engine. I did not move from my chair. I simply turned my head toward the gaps in the wooden siding and watched. A sleek, black luxury speedboat tore into the calm water of the bay, leaving a massive white wake behind it. It was completely out of place in this untouched paradise, a mechanical intrusion into the sanctuary. The boat slowed aggressively as it approached the shoreline, the hull scraping harshly against the very soft sand. I watched through the narrow slats as 5 figures disembarked. They waded through the shallow water, completely disregarding the pristine environment around them. Leading the pack was Preston. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored suit, but he still managed to look entirely arrogant in a crisp white linen shirt and designer sunglasses. His face was twisted into an ugly sneer of pure determination. Right behind him was Valerie, struggling to walk in the sand while complaining loudly about the humidity ruining her expensive hair. She was clutching a large designer handbag like a shield, looking around the wild beach with absolute disgust. Trent followed closely, sweating, profusely checking his phone and looking nervously over his shoulder as if he expected his creditors to jump out from behind the palm trees. But they had not come alone. Flanking the three siblings were two massive men dressed in identical black tactical shirts and cargo pants. They were private security guards, hired muscle brought all the way from the mainland to do the heavy lifting. They moved with a stiff, practiced aggression, scanning the tree line and the dilapidated shack. Preston had clearly run out of patience and legal maneuvers. He was reverting to raw physical intimidation. He thought that bringing armed thugs to an isolated island would finally break the stubborn old man. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid steady my nerves. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I was not afraid of them. I was disgusted by them. 45 years of my life, my sweat and my love had been poured into those three children, and this was the culmination of their character. They were marching up the beach to terrorize a 79-year-old widower simply because their own boundless greed had backed them into a deadly corner. Preston pointed a sharp finger directly at the shack, barking an order to the two security guards. The massive men nodded and began marching purposefully up the slight sandy incline, their heavy boots crushing the delicate coastal vines. Preston, Valerie, and Trent followed a few steps behind, safe behind their wall of hired muscle. I remained perfectly still at the center table. I did not reach for a weapon. I did not stand up to brace the door. I just let them come. The heavy footsteps hit the sagging wooden porch, making the entire structure groan under the sudden weight. A massive shadow fell over the front window, completely blocking out the bright morning sun. There was no polite knock. There was no announcement. There was only a sudden, explosive violence. The lead security guard raised his combat boot and kicked the front door with terrifying force. The rotting wood splintered instantly around the old rusted deadbolt. He kicked it a second time, and the swollen hinges completely tore away from the doorframe with a deafening crack. The heavy wooden door flew inward, crashing violently onto the dusty floorboards and kicking up a thick cloud of dust. The two guards immediately stepped through the ruined doorway, their hands resting aggressively on their tactical belts, filling the small space with their massive frames. They scanned the dim interior, fully expecting to find a cowering, terrified old man begging for mercy. Instead, the thick dust settled to reveal me sitting calmly at the wooden table, my hands resting lightly on either side of my coffee mug. I did not flinch when the door exploded inward. I did not break eye contact. Preston stepped over the shattered remains of the door, flanked by Valerie and Trent. The arrogant smirk had returned to his face, fueled by the sheer adrenaline of the violent entry. He took off his expensive sunglasses and stared at me, his chest heaving slightly. He looked incredibly proud of himself, completely unaware that he had just crossed a legal line from which he could never return. Every single second of his violent intrusion, the destruction of the property and the physical intimidation had just been captured in crystal-clear, high-definition video and audio. The snare had not just closed, it had locked permanently. Now it was my turn to finally spring the trap wide open. I looked right at him, waiting for his opening move. Preston stood over me, casting a long, dark shadow across the warped wooden table. He reached inside his crisp white linen shirt and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. With a flick of his wrist, he produced a pre-written check and slammed it down right next to my coffee mug. The piece of paper fluttered slightly in the humid breeze before settling on the table. I did not need to pick it up to read the bold numbers printed across the center. It was a cashier's check made out to me for $1 million. "Look at that piece of paper," Rick Preston demanded, his voice echoing in the small, dusty space. "That is a 1 with 6 zeros behind it. That is more money than a washed-up blue-collar contractor like you has ever seen at one time in his entire miserable life. All you have to do is take a pen, sign the property transfer documents I have in my bag, and you can walk away from all of this. You can take that money, buy a decent little house somewhere quiet, and live out your final few years without starving to death. I did not touch the check. I kept my hands resting flat on the table, my eyes locked directly onto his. My silence seemed to irritate him. The arrogant smirk on his face began to slip, replaced by a tight, aggressive grimace. He leaned forward, planting both of his hands firmly on the wooden planks of the table. The wood groaned loudly under his weight. "Do not play tough with me, old man," Preston sneered, leaning closer so I could smell the expensive cologne radiating off his skin. "You do not have a choice anymore. I froze your pathetic little bank accounts. I initiated the medical conservatorship back in Seattle. You have absolutely no money, no legal standing, and no way off this island. You sign the deed right now, or we get back on that boat and leave you here to rot. Nobody cares about you. Nobody is coming to save you. You are completely alone, and if you stay here, you will die alone." As he delivered his vicious ultimatum, Valerie stepped forward from the ruined doorway. She held her expensive smartphone up, the camera lens pointed directly at my face. The small red recording light on her screen was blinking steadily. She was not just documenting the moment for her own twisted amusement. She was gathering ammunition, trying to capture me, looking confused, angry, or desperate, so they could submit the footage to the mainland judge as proof of my supposed mental decline. "Say something," Rick, Valerie taunted, her voice shrill and dripping with fake concern. "Tell the camera how confused you are. Tell everyone how you wandered all the way out to Hawaii because you forgot where your actual home is. It is okay to admit that your mind is failing. We just want to help you, right, Preston? We just want to make sure you are safe in a nice, secure medical facility where professionals can look after you." She stepped closer, circling the table like a vulture, keeping the phone lens mere inches from my face. I could see my own reflection in the dark glass of her screen. I looked tired, my gray hair messy from the humid wind, my flannel shirt stained with dust. I looked exactly like the broken, defeated old man they desperately needed me to be. But my eyes were cold and completely clear. I did not give her the reaction she wanted. I did not shout, and I did not cry. Trent paced nervously near the shattered doorway, occasionally glancing out at the calm water of the bay. "Just sign the stupid paper, Rick," he muttered, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. "We do not have all day to sit around in this rotting shack. Take the $1 million and be grateful. Preston is being incredibly generous. You do not want to see what happens if you make us do this the hard way." He gestured weakly toward the two massive security guards. The two guards shifted their weight, stepping deeper into the room. They crossed their arms silently, reinforcing the threat of physical violence. They were the muscle, the heavy consequence waiting to be unleashed if the $1 million bribe failed to work. Their presence was designed to terrify me into submission. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They had broken into my home, destroyed my property, threatened my life, and attempted to extort a $50 million piece of land from me for a fraction of its true value. And they were doing it all while Valerie cheerfully recorded the entire federal crime on her smartphone. They were so blinded by their own privilege and their desperate greed that they had completely lost touch with reality. They genuinely believed that the laws of the mainland did not apply to them in this isolated tropical cove. I let the heavy silence stretch out for another long minute. I wanted every single one of their threats, every single taunt, and every single piece of extortion to be thoroughly captured by the high-definition hidden cameras I had installed in the rafters above them. I wanted the audio recorders hidden beneath the table to pick up the precise tone of Preston's malice and Trent's desperate urgency. When I felt confident that the trap had collected enough evidence to send them all to federal prison, I slowly reached out and picked up the cashier's check. Preston let out a very short, arrogant laugh, clearly believing he had finally broken my spirit. Valerie moved her camera closer to film my hands holding the paper. Trent finally stopped his relentless pacing, letting out a massive sigh of deep relief. They thought they had won. They thought I was finally surrendering, but they were about to learn a very brutal lesson. I held the crisp cashier's check between my thumb and forefinger. The expensive paper felt heavy with the weight of their profound arrogance. Preston leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his chest, his face radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who firmly believed that everyone in the world had a price. Valerie lowered her phone just a fraction of an inch, a cruel smile playing on her lips, ready to capture the exact moment my dignity shattered. Trent wiped his sweaty hands on his expensive jeans, letting out a long breath. I looked at the three of them, these spoiled adults, who had spent their entire lives treating other human beings like disposable stepping stones. Then I moved. I did not move like a broken, confused old man. I moved with the steady, deliberate strength of a contractor who had spent 50 years hauling timber and pouring concrete. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floorboards, and slowly stood up to my full height. I am not a small man, and as I straightened my spine, I forced Preston to take a half step backward. I looked down at the $1 million check in my hand. It was a fortune to most people. To me, it was nothing but an insult. I casually turned my wrist, opening my fingers, and let the piece of paper flutter down to the dusty floorboards. It landed right in the dirt next to Preston's polished leather shoes. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded, his arrogant smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a dark scowl of genuine confusion. "Pick that up and sign the transfer papers, Rick. I am not going to offer you this kind of money a second time." I ignored his childish command. Instead, I reached deep into the inside pocket of my worn canvas jacket. My fingers closed around the cold, smooth plastic of the digital audio recorder I had purchased the night before. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the wooden table right next to my coffee mug. The small screen was illuminated, displaying the running time code of the active recording. I tapped the thick plastic casing with my index finger, making sure Valerie caught the device perfectly in the frame of her smartphone camera. I looked directly into the dark lens of her phone, ensuring my voice was steady, clear, and absolutely undeniable. "This entire conversation, including your threats to abandon me on this island and your blatant attempt to extort a signature through physical intimidation, has been recorded on multiple hidden devices," I said smoothly. "And it is actively uploading to a secure off-site server maintained by my attorney." Valerie gasped, her perfectly manicured hands trembling so badly that the phone nearly slipped from her grip. She frantically tapped her screen, ending her own video, her face turning pale. Trent stumbled backward, his back hitting the wooden wall of the shack as panic set in. But Preston was too blinded by his own towering ego to understand the trap he had just walked into. He sneered, slamming his fist onto the table. "You think a cheap tape recorder is going to save you?" he shouted, his voice cracking with rising anger. "I do not care if you recorded me. You are still a broke, senile old man. I have the power of attorney paperwork filed in Seattle. I am going to take this land from you, whether you sign that deed or not. You cannot stop me." I stared at him, letting his desperate rage echo through the small wooden shack. My voice was calm and freezing cold when I finally responded. "You cannot sell what you do not own, Preston. You committed federal wire fraud." The words hung in the humid tropical air, heavy and lethal. Preston froze. The color drained from his face, his arrogant posture collapsing inward. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He knew exactly what those words meant. He knew I had seen behind his elaborate corporate smokescreen. Without breaking eye contact, I reached over to the heavy leather briefcase sitting on the floor beside my chair. I unlatched the top, pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Chemo and I had finalized just yesterday, and threw them onto the table. The heavy bundle of papers hit the wooden surface with a loud, authoritative slap. "Those are the finalized documents for an ironclad independent trust," I explained, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a steel blade. This entire property, the land, the freshwater aquifer, and the exclusive coastal access rights, has been fully transferred into this trust. I am the sole irrevocable trustee. The deed is locked away behind layers of legal protection that you can never penetrate. And if a mainland judge ever attempts to strip my rights through your fraudulent medical conservatorship, the trust automatically donates every single inch of this property to the State Conservation Authority. You get absolutely nothing. Preston stared at the legal documents, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He reached out with trembling hands and flipped to the signature page, seeing the official stamps and the dates. It was done. It was finalized before he even stepped foot on the island. You took a $10 million non-refundable deposit from an international resort conglomerate. I continued stepping around the table until I was standing inches away from him. You signed a commercial contract, promising them land you never possessed. You lied to federal regulators, you lied to the developers, and you tried to cover your massive gambling debts with stolen money. The $1 million check on the floor is useless. Your power of attorney is completely worthless. You are entirely trapped, Preston. You brought a team of bodyguards to force my hand, but all you did was deliver yourself straight to the federal authorities. You lost the entire game. Everything you worked for is gone. The heavy silence in the room was absolute. Preston stared at the legal documents as if they were venomous snakes. The color completely drained from his face, leaving a pale shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to dismantle the reality I had just built around him. But before he could formulate a single lie, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the tense air of the rotting wooden shack. It was Trent's cell phone. The upbeat ringtone echoed awkwardly in the suffocating silence, a jarring contrast to the devastation unfolding. Trent jumped, his hands shaking as he pulled the device from his jeans. He looked at the screen, his eyes widening in pure terror. "It is Gallagher," he whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "Why is the estate lawyer calling me right now?" "Answer it," I said softly, my voice perfectly calm. "You do not want to keep the messenger waiting." Trent swiped the screen with a trembling thumb and pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello," he stammered. He did not say another word. For a long, agonizing minute, Trent just listened. I watched the physical transformation take hold of him. His knees buckled, his shoulders slumped, and cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His breathing became erratic. "Oh my God," Trent gasped, his voice barely a squeak. "What do you mean they took everything?" Before Trent could even process the horrific news, Valerie's smartphone erupted in her hands. The sudden noise made her scream, dropping the device onto the dusty floorboards. She scrambled to pick it up, her perfectly manicured fingernails scraping against the rough wood. It was her personal wealth manager. She put the phone on speaker, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Valerie, you need to listen to me very carefully," a panicked voice crackled through the small speaker. "The federal authorities just raided the Seattle estate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service are currently tearing the house apart. They have seized all the corporate computers, frozen all the bank accounts, and locked down the entire $20 million estate." Valerie let out a breathless sob, pressing her hand over her mouth. "No, that is impossible," she cried. "That is our money. Mom left that to us." "It was never your money," the wealth manager shouted over the speaker, the sound of sirens blaring faintly in the background of his call. "The entire corporate portfolio is heavily leveraged and under federal investigation for massive tax evasion and wire fraud. And Valerie, it gets worse. The resort conglomerate just contacted the firm. They discovered the Hawaiian property deed was transferred to an independent trust before the commercial contract was ever finalized. They know Preston sold them a phantom property. They are pressing immediate federal criminal charges for the stolen $10 million deposit. You are completely ruined. All of you. Do not return to Seattle. You need to hire criminal defense attorneys right now." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy and completely final. Their destruction had arrived not by my hand, but by the relentless machinery of federal law. They had spent years plotting, entirely unaware their mother had laid the groundwork for their ruin. Trent dropped his phone. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud. He slid down the wooden wall of the shack, burying his face in his trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The tough, arrogant gambler was reduced to a weeping child. Valerie stood frozen in place, her expensive designer handbag slipping from her shoulder. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly at the wall, her mind completely unable to process the fact that her luxurious life of endless credit and superficial privilege was permanently over. Preston looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for the inevitable, crushing impact. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes hollow and empty. He had built his entire identity on his corporate power, his wealth, and his ability to bully anyone who stood in his way. Now he was standing in a rotting shack, thousands of miles from home, facing a massive federal indictment and a decade in prison. The two massive security guards who had stood like menacing statues just moments before suddenly shifted their posture. They looked at each other, communicating a silent understanding. They were hired muscle paid to intimidate an old man, not to protect wanted federal fugitives with completely frozen assets. Without saying a single word, the lead guard turned around and walked out the shattered doorway, his boots crunching heavily in the sand. The second guard immediately followed him, abandoning Preston, Valerie, and Trent to their fate. The muscle was gone, leaving the three cowards completely defenseless. I remained standing, watching the total collapse of their empire. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the deep, profound satisfaction of a carpenter watching a beautifully constructed load bearing wall perform exactly as it was designed to. Evelyn had drawn the brilliant blueprints, Chemo had provided the solid materials, and I had swung the heavy hammer. The structure of their greed had been completely demolished. "You called me a free housekeeper," I said to Preston, my voice cutting through the sound of Trent's pathetic sobbing. "You thought I was just an old fool who did not understand the value of $1. But you forgot the most important lesson your mother ever tried to teach you. You cannot build a strong house on a foundation of lies. It will always collapse." Preston fell to his knees right next to the discarded $1 million check. His expensive white linen shirt was stained with dust and sweat. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his arrogance completely shattered. He opened his mouth, but he had absolutely nothing left to say. The relentless federal hammer had fallen, and it had crushed them all into fine dust. For a long moment, the only sound inside the ruined structure was the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the shore outside, and the ragged, desperate gasping of Trent huddled against the wooden planks. Preston remained frozen on his knees. He stared at the dirt floorboards, his perfectly styled hair now matted with sweat and grime from the humid tropical air. The grand illusion of his power, built entirely on stolen money and an unearned inheritance, had evaporated into thin air. He slowly lifted his head to look at me, and the transformation was almost difficult to witness. The sharp, predatory gaze of the ruthless investment director was completely gone. In its place was the terrified, wide-eyed stare of a helpless child who finally realized there were no more corners to hide in. His bottom lip began to tremble uncontrollably. The sheer weight of the impending 15-year prison sentence for federal wire fraud and tax evasion was finally pressing down on his chest, squeezing the remaining arrogance right out of his lungs. He reached out with both hands, his fingers grasping at the empty air between us, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his pride. "Please, Rick." He choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine that I had never heard him use in 50 years. "You have to help us. You have to fix this. You know all the right people, and you have the $50 million property. You can hire the best corporate defense lawyers in the country to get us out of this mess. We can split the land. We can give you whatever you want. Just please do not let them send me to a federal prison. I will not survive in a place like that. I am a wealth manager, not a criminal." He was openly weeping now, fat tears rolling down his flushed cheeks and dripping onto his expensive linen shirt. He crawled forward on his knees, scraping his tailored pants against the rough wood and the scattered debris of the door his thugs had kicked in just minutes earlier. He looked up at me with an expression of pure, fabricated desperation. "Dad, please," he sobbed, using that sacred word like a cheap bargaining chip. "You are the only father I have ever known. You raised me. You cannot just stand there and let your own family go down like this. We are your children." In the background, Valerie let out a loud wail, finally breaking out of her stunned paralysis, while Trent continued to rock back and forth in the corner. I looked down at the man groveling at my boots. 45 years ago, I would have moved heaven and earth to protect him from a single scraped knee. I would have sacrificed my own life to ensure he had a warm bed and a full stomach. But the love I once carried for this family had been systematically drained out of me, replaced entirely by the cold, hardened reality of their true nature. They had thrown my canvas suitcases into the freezing Seattle rain and laughed at my pain. They had mocked my decades of hard labor, reducing my entire existence to a convenient punchline. I felt the ice flowing through my veins, chilling any lingering instinct to show them mercy. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, pulling my boots out of his desperate reach. "I am not your father," I said, my voice steady, deep, and absolutely devoid of any warmth. "I am the man who paid your bills while you sneered at my calloused hands. I am the man you tried to lock away in a medical facility to steal a piece of land. And I am definitely not your housekeeper." Preston collapsed forward, his forehead resting against the dusty floorboards, letting out a loud, hollow groan of absolute defeat. He finally understood that there was no manipulation left to deploy. The bridge had been completely burned to ashes by his own hand. I did not need to say another word to him. I simply turned my head toward the shattered doorway and gave a short, sharp nod toward the tree line. From the dense tropical foliage outside, a massive figure stepped out onto the bright sandy beach. It was Chemo. The seasoned land attorney walked up the wooden steps of the porch with a grim, satisfied smile on his weathered face. Right behind him were 4 uniformed officers from the local Hawaiian police department. Chemo had been waiting patiently, just out of sight, listening to the live audio feed I had established. He had heard every single threat, every extortion attempt, and the violent breach of the front door. The officers stepped into the shack, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, instantly assessing the chaotic scene. "Richard Caldwell," Chemo said loudly, nodding respectfully in my direction. "Are these the mainland individuals who violently destroyed your front door and unlawfully trespassed on your private trust property?" I looked at the 3 trembling siblings and nodded. "Yes, they are," I replied. The lead officer immediately stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Preston Caldwell, you and your siblings are under arrest for breaking and entering, criminal destruction of private property, and severe extortion," the officer announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Preston did not fight. He was completely broken. The officer hauled him roughly to his feet, snapping the cold steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. Valerie screamed as a second officer approached her aggressively, trying to pull away, but she was quickly subdued and handcuffed next to her ruined designer handbag. Trent surrendered without a single word, utterly defeated by the reality of his situation. I watched quietly as they were dragged away from my newly secured wooden front porch steps. The police cruisers disappeared down the dirt road, leaving a peaceful silence. I stood on the porch looking at the remains of my door. Chemo stood beside me, hands resting easily in his pockets. He looked out at the water. "They will not stay in that cell long," Chemo said. "The charges are serious, but they are state-level offenses. With whatever credit they have left, they will post bail by the afternoon. They will run. They will try to get on the first flight back to the mainland to salvage whatever they can from the federal raid in Seattle." I turned to look at him. Let them run, I replied, because they have absolutely no idea what is waiting for them at the finish line. I asked Chemo for one final favor. I wanted to see it happen. I needed to witness the absolute end of their reign of terror with my own two eyes to know for certain that my wife's final protective measure had completely succeeded. Chemo drove us to the Maui airport in his pickup truck. The terminal was bustling with sunburnt tourists, honeymooners, in floral outfits, and families dragging massive suitcases full of souvenirs. The atmosphere was bright, cheerful, and filled with the relaxed energy of a tropical vacation. We found a quiet spot on the second-floor observation balcony, looking directly down over the main security checkpoint. We waited for 3 hours. Just as I began to wonder if they had chartered a boat, the automatic sliding doors rushed open. Preston, Valerie, and Trent stumbled into the brightly lit departure hall. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, polished conquerors who had kicked down my door earlier that morning. Valerie dragged a single scuffed suitcase, her designer sunglasses, crooked mascara smeared beneath her eyes. Trent was practically vibrating with nervous energy, constantly looking over his shoulder like a hunted animal, chewing furiously on his thumbnail. And then there was Preston. His expensive white linen shirt was stained with sweat and dirt from the floorboards of the shack. His custom-tailored suit jacket was wrinkled and completely ruined. But despite his disheveled appearance, he was still desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of his corporate superiority. He pushed past tourists, ignoring their angry protests, and marched toward the priority security lane. He waved a premium boarding pass at the agent, his voice loud and demanding. He was trying to project the image of an incredibly important executive who had no time for the petty rules of ordinary citizens. Valerie and Trent hurried behind him, using his aggressive wake to cut through the crowded line. They reached the front of the security belt. Preston began throwing his expensive leather shoes and his silver watch into the plastic bins with aggressive, irritated movements. He thought he had escaped. He thought that if he could just get onto that airplane, he could fly back to Seattle, hire a team of ruthless defense attorneys, and somehow twist the law to his advantage one more time. He was wrong. As Preston reached for his bags, 4 men in dark suits stepped out from behind a frosted glass partition. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency that instantly silenced the surrounding crowd. They did not wear police uniforms. They wore small gold shields clipped to their belts. United States Marshals. The lead marshal stepped directly into Preston's path, raising a hand to stop him. Preston Caldwell. The marshal said, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of federal authority. You are completely surrounded. Do not attempt to move. Preston froze. The color instantly drained from his face for the second time that day. He looked at the marshals, then looked frantically around the terminal, searching for an exit that did not exist. There is a federal warrant for your arrest. The marshal continued, pulling a thick stack of folded paperwork from his inside jacket pocket. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and interstate extortion. Valerie dropped her scuffed suitcase. It hit the polished tile floor with a loud crack, bursting open and spilling her expensive clothes everywhere. She let out a piercing scream, but a female marshal quickly grabbed her by the arm, spinning her around and securing her wrists before she could cause a scene. Trent did not even try to run. He simply sank to his knees in the middle of the security checkpoint, burying his face in his hands, completely surrendering to the inevitable. But watching Preston was the true payoff. The arrogant director, the man who had called me a free housekeeper and threatened to leave me to die on a deserted island, was finally stripped of every single defense he possessed. The lead marshal grabbed Preston's arms forcefully, pulling them behind his back. The custom-tailored fabric of his expensive suit stretched and tore slightly at the shoulder seam under the rough treatment. The cold steel of the federal handcuffs clicked loudly into place around his wrists, locking tight. The sound was incredibly satisfying. It was the sound of justice finally catching up to decades of unchecked greed. The tourists in the security line pulled out their phones, snapping photos and recording videos of the humiliated millionaire being paraded through the airport. Preston bowed his head, trying to hide his face from the cameras, his pristine reputation completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. As the marshals led them toward a holding area, Preston glanced up toward the observation balcony. For one brief second, his eyes met mine. He saw me standing there, the blue-collar contractor, watching his empire burn to the ground. I did not smile. I did not wave. I just looked at him with the cold, unyielding strength of a man who had built a foundation out of truth. And as he was dragged out of sight, I finally felt the heavy burden of the last 45 years lift completely off my shoulders. The flight back to the mainland was a journey they had to make in federal custody. I did not follow them. I stayed in Maui, letting the warm tropical sun heal the deep chill that had settled into my bones back in Seattle. The wheels of the United States justice system turn incredibly slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Over the next 14 months, I sat on the porch of my repaired wooden shack and listened to the legal updates provided by Chemo. The federal prosecutors did not hold back. They took the pristine evidence Evelyn had secretly compiled over 5 years, combined it with the high-definition audio and video recordings I had captured in the shack, and built a criminal case that was absolutely bulletproof. Preston was the first to fall. Arrogant to the very end, he refused to take a plea deal. He genuinely believed that his smooth-talking corporate charm could somehow sway a federal judge. He spent the last of his hidden emergency funds hiring a team of aggressive defense attorneys, hoping to paint himself as a grieving son who made a simple administrative error. But the prosecution played the tapes. They played the audio of him threatening to leave a 79-year-old man to rot on an island. They showed the fraudulent commercial contract he signed with the resort conglomerate, proving he intentionally stole a $10 million deposit to cover his underground gambling debts. When the judge handed down the sentence, there was no mercy. Preston was convicted of massive wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and interstate extortion. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The man who used to terrorize boardrooms in custom-tailored Italian suits was reduced to a number stamped on a rough, oversized khaki uniform. He lost his wealth, his prestige, and his freedom. He will spend the next decade and a half locked in a concrete cell far away from the ocean views and luxury hotels he thought he deserved. Valerie suffered a completely different kind of imprisonment. When the Internal Revenue Service seized the entire $20 million Seattle estate to cover the massive tax liabilities and corporate fraud, her lavish lifestyle evaporated overnight. All of her premium credit cards were immediately declined. Her luxury vehicles were towed away in the middle of the night by federal agents. Without her mother's wealth to shield her, the crushing weight of her own personal shopping addictions came crashing down. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy. The federal court liquidated everything she owned, right down to her designer handbags and expensive jewelry, to pay back a fraction of what she owed. But the true poetry of her punishment was her new reality. A woman who had spent 48 years looking down her nose at the working class was suddenly thrust right into the middle of it. Without a college degree or any marketable skills, Valerie was forced to take a minimum wage job at a discount retail clothing store in a strip mall. The woman who once threw my heavy canvas suitcases into the freezing rain now spends 40 hours a week standing on her feet, folding cheap polyester shirts and dealing with angry customers. She lives in a cramped one-bedroom apartment riding the public bus to work every morning because she cannot afford a car. Her pride was utterly destroyed, replaced by the exhausting, relentless reality of the real world she had successfully avoided for her entire life. Trent did not fare any better. The federal raid exposed the sheer depth of his illegal gambling operations. When the government seized his assets, they took his bank accounts, his condo, and every piece of property attached to his name. But they also exposed him to his ruthless underground creditors. With no money left to pay them off, Trent was forced to turn state's evidence testifying against the illegal gambling rings just to secure federal protection. He avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but he was left absolutely destitute. He was placed in a government-mandated halfway house in a miserable industrial town miles away from his former life. He now works night shifts, washing dishes, auspicious in a greasy diner, handing over almost every single dollar he earns to court-ordered restitution. The cocky, reckless man who used to laugh at my hard work is now scrubbing burnt food off ceramic plates just to afford a warm meal. They got exactly what they deserved. The universe has a strange way of balancing the scales, but in this case the balance was enforced by the full, uncompromising weight of the United States law. I did not have to raise my hand to strike them down. I did not have to seek petty revenge. I simply stepped out of the way and let the trap they built for themselves snap shut. They were consumed by their own bottomless greed. Evelyn knew it would happen. She saw the rot spreading through her own children, and she knew she could not save them from themselves. Instead, she chose to protect the only person in her life who actually understood the value of an honest day of work. She handed them the heavy poisoned crown they so desperately wanted, and she gave me the quiet, unburdened freedom to finally rest. As the months passed, and the dramatic headlines surrounding the Caldwell family fraud case slowly faded from the mainland newspapers, I found a deep, profound sense of peace. I was no longer the free housekeeper. I was no longer the punching bag for a family of spoiled, ungrateful adults. I was simply Rick, a retired contractor, living on a beautiful island, holding the keys to a $50 million sanctuary that would never ever fall into corrupt hands. The rusted key that once felt like a cruel insult had ultimately unlocked my true salvation, proving that genuine patience and unshakable integrity will always defeat blind, arrogant greed. With Preston, Valerie, and Trent finally facing the harsh consequences of their actions, the massive shadow they had cast over my life was permanently lifted. But the resolution of their criminal cases left me with a monumental decision to make regarding the Hawaiian property. A few weeks after the airport arrest, the executives from the international resort conglomerate contacted Chemo. They were absolutely desperate. They had lost their $10 million deposit to Preston's fraud, but they still wanted the land. They officially offered me the full $50 million to dissolve the independent trust and sign over the deed. They promised to wire the funds immediately, assuring me that I could spend the rest of my days living in unimaginable luxury anywhere in the world. I sat in Chemo's small, cluttered office looking at the formal offer letter printed on thick corporate stationery. $50 million is a number that can distort a man's soul. It is the kind of money that turns family members into monsters. I had just witnessed firsthand exactly what that level of wealth does to people who lack a solid moral foundation. I slid the corporate offer across the desk back to Chemo and shook my head. I told him to reject it. I did not want their money. I did not want to see that beautiful, untouched bay turned into a massive concrete tourist trap, complete with overcrowded swimming pools and noisy luxury restaurants. Chemo smiled that deep, knowing smile of his. He did not question my decision for a single second. Instead, he pulled out a fresh stack of legal paperwork, and we got to work on establishing the final phase of Evelyn's master plan. We permanently converted the independent holding trust into a state-recognized conservation trust. I legally completely stripped the land of any future commercial development rights. The massive freshwater aquifer hidden deep beneath the volcanic rock would never be drained to fill luxury resort fountains. It would remain a protected natural resource guaranteed by law to serve the local people of Hawaii forever. The pristine crescent beach and the dense green valleys rolling down to the turquoise water were placed under the strict protection of the local environmental authority. I gave away $50 million without a second thought, and in doing so, I secured a legacy that no amount of corporate money could ever buy. It was the absolute ultimate victory over the boundless greed that had infected my stepchildren. But I did not give away everything. I kept one tiny fraction of the property for myself. I retained the legal ownership of the exact footprint where the rotting wooden shack stood, along with a narrow dirt path leading up to the coastal highway. I am a commercial contractor by trade, and I have spent my entire life building structures for other people to live in. Now I finally had the chance to build something entirely for myself. I did not hire a massive construction crew, and I certainly did not draw up blueprints for a sprawling multi-story beachfront mansion. I went down to the local hardware store, bought a new set of heavy-duty hand tools, a stack of high-quality lumber, and got to work. For the first time in months, I felt truly alive. The physical labor was a deep healing therapy. I spent the early mornings tearing out the warped, rotting floorboards and pulling down the collapsing roof beams. I reinforced the solid concrete foundation that Evelyn had so brilliantly identified decades ago. I framed new walls, installed weather-resistant windows that looked straight out over the sparkling bay, and built a sturdy, wide front porch where I could sit and drink my morning coffee. My hands, calloused and scarred from decades of hard work, found their familiar rhythm. The aches in my old joints faded away, replaced by the deep, satisfying soreness of productive, honest labor. I worked through the hot, humid afternoons, sweat pouring down my face, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the pristine shore. The local fisherman who had first brought me to the isolated cove would occasionally drop by, bringing fresh catches from the deep water. Kimo would drive out on the weekends, bringing cold drinks and helping me lift the heavier roof trusses into place. We became fast friends, two older men who understood the quiet value of protecting what is truly important. Within 6 months, the rotting shack was completely transformed into a beautiful, humble wooden cabin. It was strong, secure, and built to withstand the harshest tropical storms. It was not a $20 million estate in Seattle, but to me it was worth infinitely more. It was a home built on a foundation of absolute truth and integrity. Sitting on my newly finished porch, watching the sun dip below the Pacific horizon, I realized the true depth of what Evelyn had done for me. She did not just save me from a federal indictment. She gave me my dignity back. She allowed me to strip away the toxic, parasitic attachments of a family that only saw me as a financial stepping stone. She gave me the power to do something genuinely good for the world, and she gave me a quiet, peaceful place to spend my remaining years. The wealth was never the prize. The freedom was. Preston chased a hollow legacy built entirely on theft and intimidation. He believed that power came from taking things away from other people. But true power, the kind that actually lasts, comes from knowing exactly what to give back. The freshwater aquifer flowing beneath my new home will continue to nourish this beautiful island long after I am gone. That water will never belong to a greedy corporation or an arrogant investment director. It belongs to the land. And for the first time in my long, complicated life, I can finally say that I belong here too. I am finally, truly home. The mornings here are different than anywhere else I have ever lived. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over the bay right before the sun fully crests over the volcanic cliffs. I wake up early not because an alarm clock forces me to, and not because I have a frantic construction schedule to manage, but simply because my body rests easier now. I walk out onto the wide wooden porch I built with my own hands, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. The floorboards are smooth beneath my bare feet, perfectly leveled and solidly secured to the ancient bedrock below. I sit down in a heavy cedar rocking chair I carved over the winter. I take a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms, and I look out across the crystal-clear turquoise water. The surface is like glass, undisturbed by the mechanical roar of luxury speedboats or the chaotic demands of mainland life. A graceful pair of sea turtles glide silently over the vibrant, colorful coral reef just a few short yards away from the shoreline. The salty breeze carries the sweet scent of wild hibiscus and damp earth. It is a truly profound, entirely uninterrupted sense of peace. I sit here and watch the horizon, my mind naturally drifting back across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean to the life I left behind in Seattle. I think about the 45 years I spent married to Evelyn. For so long, I measured the success of my life by how much weight I could carry for other people. I thought my purpose was to be the quiet, unshakable foundation, holding up a glittering corporate empire that I never truly belonged to. I patched the holes in the roof, I paid off the secret debts, and I absorbed the endless disrespect from her children, silently convincing myself that love meant enduring the pain without complaint. I accepted my role as the background character, the blue-collar contractor, who was barely tolerated at the fancy dinner parties. I let them call me the free housekeeper because I believed that keeping the peace was more important than protecting my own dignity. But sitting here, the quiet warmth of the Hawaiian sun, surrounded by the raw, natural beauty of this isolated sanctuary, the perspective completely shifts. I finally understand the absolute genius of my late wife's final act. For months, I believed that the rusted key and the hidden property were simply weapons she provided so I could execute her final judgment upon Preston Valerie and Trent. I thought she was just using me as the instrument of their destruction, a way to punish their boundless greed from beyond the grave. But Evelyn was infinitely wiser than that. She did not just set a brilliant trap for her corrupt children. She designed an intricate, beautiful escape route specifically for me. She knew that if she had simply left me a pile of money or a comfortable mainland house, my deeply ingrained sense of duty would have kept me tethered to them. I would have spent my final years bailing Trent out of jail, paying for Valerie's bankruptcies, and suffering Preston's relentless arrogance. I would have slowly suffocated under the heavy weight of their endless demands. By leaving me with nothing but a rusted key and forcing them to throw me out into the freezing rain, she forcefully shattered the invisible chains of my obligation. She made them sever the tie, knowing my pride would never let me crawl back to them. She pushed me to the absolute edge of my endurance, forcing me to remember the tough, capable contractor I used to be before the wealth and the toxic family politics ground me down into a tired old man. She made me fight for my survival, and in doing so she reminded me of my own inherent strength. Evelyn did not just save me from the catastrophic fallout of the federal criminal investigation. She gave me the ultimate gift of genuine, unburdened freedom. She gave me permission to finally stop building shelters for ungrateful people and start building a life entirely for myself. I take another slow sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, profound gratitude swell inside my chest. The anger and the bitter resentment that burned so fiercely inside me during those first few weeks on the island have completely washed away, carried out to sea by the shifting twists. I do not hate Preston Valerie or Trent anymore. I simply feel a quiet, distant pity for them. They are locked away in their concrete cells and their miserable lives trapped by the very greed they worshipped. But I am free. I am sitting on the edge of the world, surrounded by a breathtaking sanctuary that will remain pure and untouched long after I am gone. The massive freshwater aquifer beneath my boots continues to flow, a silent, powerful testament to the enduring strength of nature and the vital importance of protecting what is real. I watch the morning sun climb higher into the bright blue sky, the golden light dancing across the gentle waves of the bay. I am 79 years old, but as I breathe in the clean, salty air, I feel younger and more vibrant than I have in decades. The rusted key is no longer a symbol of betrayal or a weapon of revenge. It is framed in a small wooden box on my living room wall, a permanent reminder of the journey that brought me back to myself. I finish the last drop of my coffee, place the ceramic mug on the wooden railing, and close my eyes. For the first time in 45 years, I am not worrying about tomorrow. I am just peacefully listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the vast ocean, resting in the beautiful, quiet certainty that I am finally exactly where I am supposed to be today. As the sun sets completely behind the dark volcanic cliffs, casting a brilliant array of deep purple and gold across the quiet water of the bay, I find myself thinking about the concept of family. For the majority of my life, I believed that family was simply a matter of shared history and proximity. I believed that if you provided for people, If you paid their debts and fixed their broken roofs and shielded them from the consequences of their own reckless decisions, they would eventually learn to love and respect you. But I was wrong. Blood does not make a family. Respect does. The people who genuinely care about you do not look at your calloused hands and see a free housekeeper. They do not look at your advancing age and see an opportunity for a medical conservatorship. True family is found in the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them but your company. I found more genuine brotherhood in Kimo, a local land attorney I had just met, and the quiet fisherman who gave a broke old man a ride in his boat than I ever found in the 3 children I spent 45 years raising. There is a profound lesson to be learned here, not just for the younger generation, but for anyone who finds themselves slowly fading into the background of their own life. Do not ever mistake the silence of an older man for weakness. Do not look at our gray hair, our slower footsteps, or our quiet demeanor and assume that our minds have gone soft. We grew up in a world that did not hand out safety nets. We survived eras of extreme financial hardship, global uncertainty, and grueling physical labor that most modern privileged people could not even begin to handle. We built the very foundations of the comfortable lives they currently take for granted. We know how to measure twice and cut once. When we sit quietly at a dinner table, while you speak down to us, we are not failing to understand you. We are simply observing you. We are gathering information, calculating your character, and deciding exactly how to respond when the time is right. Preston thought my silence in that mahogany-paneled office meant I had surrendered. He did not realize that I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to pull the critical support beam right out from under his corrupt empire. It is incredibly difficult to walk away from the people you have spent your entire life loving. It goes against every single protective instinct you have as a provider. You want to believe that if you just give them one more chance, if you write just one more check, they will finally change their ways. But toxic people do not change when you reward their terrible behavior. They only grow bolder, more entitled, and infinitely more dangerous. You have to find the courage to draw a permanent line in the sand. You have to look at the people who are using you, taking advantage of your kindness, and confidently tell them that the free ride is permanently over. You owe it to yourself to protect your own peace, your own dignity, and your own hard-earned resources. I had to lose everything I thought I knew about my life in Seattle to finally discover the incredible unburdened freedom waiting for me on this isolated Hawaiian beach. Evelyn understood that brutal truth, and she forced me to learn it by throwing me directly into the deep end of the ocean. Now it is my turn to pass that hard-earned wisdom on to you. I am sharing this deeply personal chapter of my life because I know with absolute certainty that I am not the only person who has ever faced this kind of quiet domestic betrayal. Right now, there is someone listening to my voice who is being manipulated by their own children. There is a hard-working parent out there who is being drained dry by ungrateful relatives, or an older individual who is being threatened with a nursing home simply because their family wants to cash in on their estate early. If you are in that situation, I want you to hear me clearly. You have the power to stop them. You have the right to secure your own assets, to change your will, and to completely cut off the financial supply to anyone who treats you with disrespect. You are not a burden, and you are certainly not a stepping stone. If my story gave you the courage to finally stand up to those who use you, please share it. Send this to someone who desperately needs to hear that survival is possible and that justice can be served. We all need a community that understands the heavy burdens we carry. That is why I decided to sit down on this porch and record my story for you today. So I want to hear directly from you. Did you like my story? Did you feel a sense of satisfaction when the federal marshals finally closed in on Preston at the airport security checkpoint? Tell me your thoughts and please let me know which city you are listening from. I am sitting here on the beautiful western coast of Maui, Hawaii, watching the stars slowly appear over the vast ocean, and it brings me immense joy to know my voice is reaching you wherever you are in the world. Let us meet in the comments section below and continue this important conversation. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another video. If this story resonated with you and you want to support my channel, please leave a super thanks if you can. It helps me keep bringing more life stories like this to the light. Thank you for your time. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.